Well, it's a pleasure to be here today and talk with Deb and Cliff on this important topical areas. I have to first recognize one of my good mentors when I first got in this field back in the 1980s, Mark Stennis. And a phrase that Mark said about Dutch elm disease and oak wilt management, whether you like it or not, it's going to cost you money. And to me, that's one of those take-home messages that with any pest problem or any pathogen problem, it's going to cost you money. As managers, our job is to minimize the cost and actually also look at the benefits. So we could take American elm as one of our models. We have a lot of cool historical evidence to say if you do this, one outcome will happen. I'll talk briefly about that, or if you do another outcome, another opportunity will await you. But one thing with Dutch elm disease or emerald ash borer, if you do nothing, it's going to cost you money. Trees are going to have to be removed. And if you choose to replant the trees, there's also that additional cost. So one important message from Dutch elm disease, which actually it's kind of cool with emerald ash borer, is with DED, it took about 40 years to get this graph up in technology transfer to people. Basically what it says, if you actually do nothing, we can just call that no control. And this no control right here is most all the trees are going to be dead within 1 or 2 decades. But if you practice sanitation, okay, that was the technology. It still works today for elms. And with a lot of other pest problems, you take care of diseased trees, reduce them before they become a brood site for insects, and you can actually greatly minimize the loss of trees. Now, we could also look at this and say, what happens if you actually do very little? In the case of Minneapolis, I'm going to use that as a model city. If they did nothing, actually, they're going to have most all their trees gone in about a 12-year time period. Now, if they actually practiced intense sanitation, they'd have actually most all their trees, well, half their population or so remaining about a quarter century later. Well, what was actually an actual outcome in Minneapolis? It's kind of interesting to note that most all their elms, their elm management program, which was very intensive sanitation, actually did follow what you'd expect. So if I was a decision maker and I said, yeah, go ahead, we're going to fund you for intensive sanitation back in 1978, and 25 years later you can come back and say this is the actual outcome was very close to what we predicted, that's a great success story. We're starting to develop that actually with our ash, but I just want to point out we have this historical, very neat information that says that if you follow some biological basis for decision making, and you will potentially get this outcome. Another important message, and this was pointed out with both Cliff and Deb, that if you do nothing, there's this big pulse of money up front, where you have to spend a lot of money, in this case actually removing dead elms. Now if you actually practice intensive sanitation, it's still going to cost you money, but what you're doing is you're equalizing this cost of money over time. Now again, use Minneapolis as a model. What did they expect? They expected some years maybe to be right on track with what the cost would be for removal of trees. Some years maybe slightly above, other years slightly below. But over a great time period, you greatly stabilize the cost of this particular disease. Some recent work we did with the city of Milwaukee, actually, we had a question. Now, Milwaukee was about a decade too early in the game of getting Dutch elm disease. They didn't have the technology. So this dotted line is the actual loss of elms over time in Milwaukee. So we did some modeling to say, what if they would have done a best, good, or fair? Again, they didn't have the technology available to do these practices, but about a decade behind the times. And if you look at no control, this would be kind of the outcome. Our question actually was on kind of stormwater is one of the questions that we're actually modeling right now. But we built the simulator basically to do this. If you're looking at tree canopy, here's what's kind of neat. What do you see? Over time, with the best scenario, or you could apply this also to your emerald ash borer work, that over time your canopy is going to grow. Cliff pointed this out with one of his last slides. Your canopy is going to grow. You could actually do good sanitation. You're going to stabilize the canopy over time. Or if you do nothing, you're going to lose canopy over time. Okay? But the nice thing here is it gives you some opportunity to stabilize canopy or grow canopy while you're doing tree replacements with a more diverse forest. So let's get to emerald ash borer. I got into this research probably 5 to 6 years ago. I actually needed a tree inventory for an urban forest class they teach, so I convinced some students that work for me to collect about 2,000 trees on campus to see what species we have, their sizes, And then we had this inventory, and I started asking the question, what would be the impacts of managing for emerald ash borer? And so what if we got rid of all our ash? And we could just call that getting rid of all our ash in 5 years. Or if we use approved insecticide treatments, or if we do nothing, or if we remove all the ash and replace them. Or we could also compare what if we didn't have emerald ash borer. So when we started doing our modeling, a couple different ways. You could look at the compensatory value and the functional. Functional would be stormwater benefits, energy conservation, air pollution amelioration. Compensatory would be the value of a tree if it was lost. So let's say someone runs over a car or a tree with a car. What would be the cost of that tree, of the value that they would have to compensate you for the loss of that tree? So there's two different ways we're doing our modeling. This is the part right after lunch that isn't conducive for staying awake, but here's all it says, is you have a value of a tree and you have costs to maintain that tree. If you're looking at trees that are left in a population, you have the value minus all the costs. Okay, so for maintenance, for treatment, for removal, for pruning, planting, and then you can discount this over time using some discount rate. And so what you can get is a net present value. So what you're doing is you're accounting for money over time, the value of that, the value of a tree, plus subtracting all the costs to maintain that tree. So in our work, we actually put this all in a simulator that you can actually get at the various sites. And one of the aspects of the simulator is when we first did the work, it's pretty easy to comprehend that if you get rid of all your trees in 5 years, you have none left. If you actually preemptively remove and replace after a 20-year time period with the normal mortality that we built in the calculator, this is the number of trees you'd expect for that cohort. If you actually have no emerald ash borer in an area, this would what you'd normally expect. If you treat your trees using the science that Deb pointed out, highly successful with several of the insecticides, you're going to certainly lose some trees, but not much compared to what you'd expect with normal mortality. And then here's the simulation if you do nothing. This was actually one line that we're kind of concerned about when we first did our modeling, because we built it, this mathematical model based on an abstract from Kathleen Knight. I was really happy to see about a couple years after we got into this work, the work of Dan Herms, where they actually looked at the loss of ash cohort over time in an area. And if anything, our simulator probably slightly underestimates the loss of ash trees over time. So here, a lot of information actually to put in this calculator. At first glance, it may look like that. There's actually notes on what the information is about that you have to actually enter, and not all information actually needs to be entered, and I'll slightly get into some of these parameters here in the next few slides. And then actually, if you scroll over to this little red box in the simulator, it'll actually give you more information on where the data came from. So take something about an ash population. If you want to figure out the cost of emerald ash borer management, you certainly have to know how many trees you have, their mean size, maybe ask the question, what would be the outcome if I got rid of all the trees in 5 years? And then you can actually simulate the growth of trees. In our study area in Milwaukee, ash put on about a ½ an inch of growth a year. In the Chicago area, it's probably 0.6 to 0.7 of an inch per year. Some other things you have to add is what are the costs for management? So maintenance, such as pruning or removing of trees or treatment. Now these are all default values in our simulator. And one thing about those, these values, where did we get them from? Actually, Greg McPherson's work in the Midwest Tree Guide. And we actually adjusted for inflation, so these are actually 2012 values. Our removal costs, for example, include stumps. Now, if you have your own records, that's even better yet. City of Milwaukee, for example, these are production records that I developed their actual cost on the maintenance, for example, for pruning. So if a 2-inch tree, it's going to cost you, on average, $20. And you're probably saying, how can they do that for $20? Well, they're doing it once every 5 years, so the actual cost is $100. But on a per annual basis, it's $2.03. Again, the removal costs and their treatment costs. Now, $3.75, actually a little bit lower than the private costs in Chicago. How do they do that? They do it in-house with staff, and this is staff and pesticide cost. So the other part is actually calculating the value is based on CTLA information, and there's regional guides for doing that. So what's one of our outcomes? If you see green, that's more desirable. Red is least desirable. So here's the outcome. And I'm just going to focus on a few things because there's a lot of information here. But if I look at the net value of the urban forest of ash, what do I find out? that treatment actually retains the greatest net value. So this is the value of the ash trees minus all the costs associated with maintaining this over a 20-year time period. And then we have some other important information pieces. We can look at the benefit-cost ratio of stuff, and I'll talk about this briefly here in a second. We can look at the actual removal cost information. We can look at the planting costs. We can look at the treatment costs. So this slide actually illustrates it pretty much more clearly. If we're just looking at the cost of treatment, all we have then is the least costly is getting rid of all your ash trees, okay? But if we actually look at the cost of no control or treatment, it gives you a sense that, yeah, here's the actual outcome for emerald ash borer. If we look at the actual net present value, again, this is the value minus the costs, what do you find out? A much different story, similar to what Cliff ended with. That treatment actually is very effective, very cost effective, especially when you look at benefit cost ratios compared to doing nothing or getting rid of all your trees and replanting. So the last slide I'd say is with our emerald ash borer work, it's no different than any urban forest management work. With the added context, we have to manage for pests. But if I have an ash tree, I'm still going to look and say, would I treat this tree? No, it's a tree risk of great hazard. It would come down. So that part of urban forest management still doesn't change. We have the added angle of dealing with things cost effectively. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the moderators.